Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Kate Moore. Kate is a New York Times and USA Today bestselling author. She's a British writer based in London, and today we will speak about her latest book, The Woman They Could Not Silence. One woman, her incredible fight for freedom, and the men who tried to make her disappear. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me on.
So, okay, this is an amazing subject because a lot of people get accused of being mentally ill, and most of those people being accused are either women or people from minority groups or people who have been disenfranchised from society in one way or another. And you highlight that in your book. So we will speak a lot about that. But before, I would like to know a little bit about your background. I just mentioned that you are in England. What is it that inspired you to become a writer and then a nonfiction author as well?
Well, I think writing's always been in my blood and in my soul, from sort of ever since I was a tiny girl. I've always loved writing stories and things like that. So as I grew up, it was still something that ran in my veins, basically. And I was lucky enough that my career before I became a writer was to work in publishing. So I worked as an editor and an editorial director, helping other people with their manuscripts and, crafting them and learning about how to tell a good story through working with other authors. And then in 2014, I decided, to take a leap of faith, and I left my editorial job and became a freelance writer and editor. And to my absolute shock and delight, I was able to support myself as a writer. And I wrote lots of different nonfiction books. So I wrote gift books and humor books and books about a cat. They were all nonfiction books. And what I really love above all else is telling a story. So they were narrative nonfiction books, which means they're all true and they're all based in fact, but they are written almost like a novel. So even though you're reading about real people or real cats, you go on a story and a journey with the protagonists and with the characters. And I've actually always worked on nonfiction, even as an editor, and it's something I feel passionate about, that nonfiction can actually be a story and be gripping. And my history books, as this one is, The Woman They Could Not Silence is a history book, but I hope that it reads like a novel, as do all my other books.
It does. Okay, fiction or nonfiction, there's always this debate, and some authors go into the nonfiction, some people go into fiction exclusively. Why do you choose nonfiction?
To be honest, I think it was a natural follow-on from my career as an editor, in those are the kind of books that I knew how to craft and, to be honest, knew how to sell as well, because, as I say, I was supporting myself as a writer. And nonfiction was what I knew best. So I think that's firstly where it came from. And then having, been able to do it, I absolutely love the craft involved now in doing all my research, immersing myself in the historical records and the historical facts, and then, putting them through that transformative process so that the book reads like a novel, but it is all based in fact. That is something that I really enjoy doing.
And how much creative license does a nonfiction author has? I mean, obviously you were not there, but you described the events as if you were there. So where does an author like yourself draw the line? Okay, I can just speculate about this so that the story moves better, but here's my line, and then this, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do try very much to stick on the line of what I know. And, there are a few places in the book where I don't know what happened and we can only speculate. And actually, I do speculate. So there is an example, for example, there's a bit where Elizabeth Packard, my protagonist of The Woman They Could Not Silence, has a confrontation with her psychiatrist. And we know that there was a confrontation, but we don't know exactly what happened. We only have, you know, certain details about the scene, which I've put in the book. And so I do say, you know, what happened? Did her psychiatrist shout at her? Did he grab her by the elbows? Did he slam the table in rage? We do not know. She did not say. And so there are bits like that, I think, where I'm honest about the fact I don't know, but I'm still painting a scene for the reader that they can imagine. You know, we don't know exactly what happened, but we can try and fill in the blanks through supposition. But whenever I'm writing, I do always stick to the facts that we know. And I was lucky enough with this book to have a tranche of first person material enabling me to know what it was like there, because even though I personally wasn't there on the scene when it happened, the person on whose memoir, letter, trial evidence was there, and they've told me what it was like. And that's how I've been able to conjure this world so viscerally.
When you took a leap of faith and you went on your own, I read in your bio that you were surprised you got commissioned for 4 books. I wonder, how do you fragment them in your mind and be able to work on more than one project at a time?
Yeah, I was very lucky, and I have to say, you know, anyone else who wants to be a writer who's listening to this thinking, how on earth do you get 4 commissions? A lot of it was contact. So some of those 4 books were my own ideas, pitching to editors, you know, doing that graft to get the books written. Others came about because I had an editor friend who needed a ghostwriter, for example, who said, why don't you ghostwrite this book for me? So I did some ghostwriting as well when I first started out as a writer. And how you keep them separated in your mind? Well, I never write more than 1 book at a time. I can research several books at once, and then that's very compartmentalized. You know, you're working on that book, and, you know, this is the research material that you're using. But when I'm actually writing, I'm immersed in that one world and going on that one journey.
Right. And at what moment did you decide to write your own book? And also, can you tell us a little bit about it? Because you won many prizes for that first book.
Yeah, so the book, you know, is my first history book, the Radium Girls. The genesis of that book was so serendipitous. So as well as being a writer, I also love theatre, directing and acting. And I've always done that in my spare time. It's just something I feel passionate about. And in 2014, I just made my directorial debut with a production of Lorca's Blood Wedding, and had loved the experience so much that I really wanted to find another play to direct. And as a female director, I wanted to put on a play that had great female roles for actresses, and that was about, you know, strong women, you know, women who were the protagonists in their own right. And so I Googled, in searching for my next play, great plays for women. And a play that came back on that Google search was called These Shining Lives by Melanie Marnich. And it's about the American Radium Girls from the First World War and Roaring Twenties. And fell in love with the script, ended up putting the play on, and conducted research because I knew it was based on a true story and I wanted my theatre production to be authentic. And I was stunned to discover through my research that no book existed that focused on the real Radium Girls and the women themselves, you know, telling that story, as I say, walking in step with the women, celebrating their personal triumphs and tragedies. And I was completely passionate about the Radium Girls by this point. And so I thought, well, if no one else has done it, why don't I? You know, why don't I write that book? You know, they always say, write the book you want to read. And that was what happened in this instance. And so it was a real labor of love. You know, I went on this amazing research trip to America, you know, spent a month traveling around, interviewing the women's families, traveling to the sites that I write about in the book. And yes, to my absolute amazement, the book, when it was published, became a New York Times bestseller. It won the Goodreads Choice Award for Best History. The American Library Association named it as a notable nonfiction book. Completely blown away by it, and a real divergence from what I'd done before. I hadn't written history books before. I'd done a lot of ghostwriting. I'd written books about cats, as I say. It was a complete new direction for me, but one that actually I think did make sense, because even as a ghostwriter, I was about, it's about helping people to tell their story. As a ghostwriter, you immerse yourself in someone else's world. And that's what I do with my history books too. I'm there to sort of channel these people from the past and help them to have a voice. And that's how I feel about the Radium Girls and about my new book, The Woman They Could Not Silence. I'm there to help these people from history have a voice and to tell you their story.
I devote a couple of hours every day towards reading. That's my biggest habit. And I'm beginning to notice more and more titles where there are strong women as protagonists of the story. I wonder if this is just my imagination, or is this a tendency that you are seeing as well?
No, I think it is definitely a resurgence, and you'll notice it even in the title, the Radium Girls, The Woman They Could Not Silence, other books, the Code Girls, for example. Code Girls is another great book. So yes, there is actually a sort of publishing phenomenon at the moment where, people are wanting to read about female protagonists, and there is a kind of, nascent movement to reestablish almost the sort of history canon with more of a focus on women, because women have been overlooked in the past, and there are a lot of writers seeking to redress that balance and to bring to light these amazing historical stories that feature women as the main protagonist.
Yeah, I see it as a positive sign that finally we are achieving gender equality. So as people write and share the stories of a strong woman, that will inspire other little girls to become strong women as well and take a role of leadership instead of a supporting role for their husbands, boyfriends, whatever. So I find that this is a great inspiration for the next generation of young women coming up and being leaders.
Yes, I hope so too. And I think Elizabeth Packard, the protagonist of my book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, I think she's absolutely an inspiration exactly to that generation that you talk about. She is a woman who, faces an awful situation. She's a sane woman sent to an insane asylum in the 19th century. And yet Elizabeth faces this trauma and this suffering and grows because of it. She writes herself, "The worst that my enemies can do, they have done, and I fear them no more." And she becomes this fearless woman, this woman who finds her unsilenceable voice. And I think that story of growing stronger through suffering and finding your voice and then using that voice to make the world a better place is absolutely an inspiration to everyone, male or female. But I really hope it inspires the next generation too.
And how do you stumble upon this story?
So I deliberately went searching for Elizabeth's story. So I was inspired to write The Woman They Could Not Silence because of the Me Too movement in the fall of 2017. And what really struck me about that incredible, empowering movement was that finally women were being listened to and believed. And it got me thinking, well, why hasn't that happened before? Why has it taken till the fall of 2017 for all these historic, allegations of sexual abuse to come to light, and for people finally to listen and start to hold these long-term abusers to account? And it got me thinking, all my ideas coalesced around a single realization. For centuries, whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. And that is the genesis idea behind the book. That's the idea that I wanted to explore. But as I say, I am a storyteller. I'm a writer who, likes to create these worlds and take readers on journeys. So I didn't want to write a polemic about how women have been oppressed through the use of their mental health. I wanted to find one woman's story in history that would allow me to take readers on a compelling and gripping, dramatic adventure, but through that story, for them to reflect upon this reality, a reality that still resonates today. And so to find Elizabeth, I essentially fell down this, rabbit warren of internet searches about women and madness. I didn't know where I was going to land in time. You know, it could have been the 1950s and 60s with electric shock treatments and lobotomies going on, and so on and so forth. In fact, the search led me to a University of Wisconsin essay that I found online about lunacy in the 19th century. And 4 pages in, there was a reference to a woman called Elizabeth Packard. Never heard her name before that moment. And I then started looking into her story because it sounded promising. And very quickly I realized Elizabeth was the woman I wanted to write about next, because she is extraordinary, but perhaps even more extraordinary than her is her story. You know, it's full of drama. It's got, you know, courtroom trials. It's got gothic horror taking you inside the insane asylums of the 19th century. It's got this fight against injustice. And it's got this compelling heroine at its heart. And so once I knew her name and knew her story, I was completely hooked that this was the book I was going to write next.
So you started a story on the year 1860, which is a few years before the Civil War. So there were people talking about rumbles about the war. Can you tell us at that time in history, what kind of rights a woman had, if any?
Yes, well, no rights for married women in particular at all, because there was this law known as coverture, which America had inherited from England, funnily enough. Seems we Brits have got a lot to answer for. And coverture said the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. And it meant that when married women took their vows, they lost their civic identity, essentially. They became legally a mere shadow of their spouse. So married women had no rights to the custody of their children, no rights to their own earnings, no rights even to their very liberty. A husband had the right to lock up his wife, to, as they put it in the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, a husband had the power to administer chastisement. And that's certainly what Elizabeth Packard's husband did in sending her to an insane asylum, even though she was sane. She was simply assertive and had her own opinion.
And how common was this practice? I see Elizabeth's husband as an insecure person that maybe his ego was, he had a fragile ego and he saw a competitor in his wife. But how common was this practice that because you get some resistance from your wife, you just put her in the asylum?
Well, crazily, crazy is the word, this was the received medical wisdom of the age, which is that a woman who was assertive, who kicked back against her husband, who insisted on her right to her own opinion, a woman who studied, a woman who read, even just reading a novel. Doctors at the time thought all those women were mad, because the idea was that a woman, you know, in the 19th century, they thought women should be satisfied to be mothers and wives. That was her natural feminine role. And any woman who pushed those boundaries in any way was seen as insane. And the official diagnosis was moral insanity. And the definition of that is eccentricity of conduct, which meant that any woman, as I say, who was acting in a way that was perceived as unfeminine, therefore unnatural, was seen as diseased and mentally ill. And this is, you know, what is written about in the medical journals of the time, you know, the records of the asylum that I researched. This is what it says, you know, a cause of insanity is novel reading, and any woman who even expresses dislike for the society of her husband is seen as insane, because surely, you know, a woman married to her husband, well, the husband should be the dearest gentleman in her life. You know, for a woman to say, no, I hate my husband, well, that's insane. So yes, so this was commonplace at the time in which Elizabeth was maneuvering. But actually, I think we can still see today any woman who challenges the powers that be, who pushes boundaries too far, she will still face an allegation of insanity even today.
Wow. Okay. So we're not gonna tell the whole story, but she finally overcomes all her difficulties, and she does a lot for the cause of women's rights. Can you tell us about some of the achievements that she uh, did in regards to advance women's rights?
Absolutely. So yes, Elizabeth, as I say, she begins the book as a 43-year-old housewife and mother of six, a woman who actually has been contented with her domestic sphere. And as you say, you know, she pushes the boundary simply by standing up to her husband, insisting on her right to her own mind. She's sent to the asylum, and through that crucible of suffering becomes a stronger woman and ultimately becomes a political campaigner. And you're right, she has left an extraordinary legacy improving the rights for women. She campaigned, for example, that women should have equal rights in law as their husbands do. So essentially the overthrow of coverture is what she aspires to, and she manages to do that in some states. In other states, it's more sort of tapping away at the inequalities. So she works on a bill so that women are entitled to keep their own earnings and their husbands can't simply siphon them off. So step by step and state by state, Elizabeth campaigns to improve the rights of women. And she was particularly concerned that married women should have their own identity and that their husbands shouldn't have the power to lock them up in asylums, as is the case when Elizabeth is sent away. And she campaigns as well, not only for the rights of women, but also for those of the mentally ill, because having been locked up in an insane asylum, she appreciates just how powerless and how much of a stigma there is for those who are mentally ill. So she achieves things like inspections of asylums, which didn't exist before Elizabeth began her campaigning. You know, independent inspections in some states. She even insisted a woman should be on that inspection board. And also campaigned for things like, you know, no censorship of patients' mail, and other, you know, strides forward so that they were seen as human beings and not just, you know, people that had no, you know, human rights or even any humanity because they'd lost their minds. She always saw the humanity in her fellow patients, and she takes that with her on her political campaigns as well.
Well, not only you tell us an amazing story, but the way that you tell it is extremely gripping. I
Thank
had
you.
to, after this interview, I had to finish my book. But I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow you or find out what you are up to?
Of course, thank you. So the book is The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore. And you want to find more information, you can visit my website, www.kate-moore.com or kate-moore.com. I'm also on Twitter at Kate Books, and you can find me on Facebook as well.
Okay, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's wonderful to talk to you.